Hey, 42 here. This woman was not meant to be on this plane. The year is 1972, and the woman in question is flight attendant Vesna Vulovic. And she was only aboard JAT Flight 367 that day because the airline mistook her for another woman also named Vesna, and they mistakenly put her name on the roster. Even after the mistake was noticed, she said she would still like to work the flight because it was heading to Belgrade with stopovers in Copenhagen and Zagreb, and she was particularly excited to go to Denmark for the first time. Vesna didn't know it at the time, but by accepting that job, she accomplished two incredible miracles. Firstly, she inadvertently saved the life of the other Vesna who was meant to be on the plane. And secondly, she became the first person to fall from 33,333 feet without a parachute and survive. Or did she? This is the almost unbelievable story of Vesna Vulovic, the person who holds the Guinness World Record for the highest fall survived by a human without a parachute. But some people consider Vulovic's story to be too unbelievable. In fact, some people say the entire story is a cover-up for something far more sinister. So what's the truth? Let's find out. Today, we have a problem. We're drowning in distraction. We're overworked, stressed, and burning out. We rely on the wrong energy sources far too often, and people look for quick fixes like excess caffeine or sugary energy drinks. But there's a better, healthier solution. Magic Mind shots are packed with organic, California-grown matcha, and matcha naturally contains both caffeine and L-theanine. And that second ingredient is the key. L-theanine smooths out caffeine release in your body, so you no longer get jitters. The energy boosts last for longer, and it eliminates that post-caffeine slump commonly experienced with coffee. I originally tested Magic Mind for 7 days after they reached out to sponsor me, and they sent me some. And the difference was transformational. These slayed my midday energy slumps. I spend most of my days writing, and I honestly noticed the effects. After taking Magic Mind for a week, there was a serious bump in my daily word count and quality. That's pretty cool, so I've continued drinking Magic Mind shots every day since. So to try Magic Mind for yourself, follow the link in the description and use code 42, or scan the QR code on screen to get 48% off your Magic Mind subscription. Also, they're so confident in what they've built that you've got 100 days to ask for a full refund if you don't like it. No questions asked. Even if you drank the shots, so there's literally no risk. Don't miss out. And a big thanks to Magic Mind for sponsoring this video. Vulovic was born in Belgrade in 1950. After taking a trip to London, driven by her love of the Beatles, she decided she'd really like to visit London more often. So she thought, why not become an air hostess? Then she could travel to London several times a year and get paid for it. So when she turned 21, she got a job with JAT Airlines, which was at the time the national airline of Yugoslavia. And so, only a year into the job, she mistakenly found herself working a shift on JAT Flight 367, a McDonnell Douglas DC-932 aircraft. Departing from Stockholm at 1:30 p.m, it was scheduled to fly to Belgrade, with layovers in Copenhagen and Zagreb. It did reach its stop in Copenhagen, but after departing from there, it would never arrive in Zagreb because of the mystery man. Vulovic later noted that whilst disembarking in Copenhagen airport, her and a bunch of passengers noticed a man behaving erratically. He was in a hurry to leave the plane and was getting rather irate. Only once that same plane was back up in the air, headed for Zagreb, would it become clear why Mystery Man was so eager to get off of it. Because he had checked a bomb inside a suitcase into the plane's luggage hold back in Stockholm. 45 minutes after JAT 367 left Copenhagen with Vulovic and 27 other crew and passengers on board, there was a sudden, incredibly violent explosion. It ripped through the baggage compartment, and the DC-9 aircraft was torn in two above the mountainous border of Czechoslovakia. just outside the village of Srbska Kaminska. As the two parts of the plane and hundreds of chunks of smouldering debris came tumbling out of the sky, 19 of the passengers were sucked out of the fuselage due to a loss of cabin pressure. All the other passengers died as a result of injuries either sustained as the plane violently broke in half and threw them around the cabin, or from the eventual collision with the ground. Actually, that's not quite true, because only 27 of the 28 people on board actually died that day. Against all worldly odds, there was one lone survivor, our heroine, Vesna Vulović. Now, before I tell you how she survived, let me just paint a little picture for you. Vulović fell from a staggering 33,333 feet, completely unaided and unsupported. No parachute and no padding. Just to give you some context for how utterly crazy that is, falls from 4 stories, or about 40 feet, are usually fatal, and falls from 8 stories high carry a 100% mortality rate. That's about 90 to 100 feet, by the way. And Vulović survived the fall from 33,333 feet. Terminal velocity is reached at 1,500 feet. At that altitude and higher, a human falling to the ground will be plummeting at 120 miles per hour. Physics, biology, and common sense all tell us that a fall without a parachute from 33,000 feet should be literally impossible to survive. So how did Vulović do the impossible? Well, there were 4 key factors that all lined up in perfect harmony to save Vulović's life that day. And had any one of these 4 things not been true, it's almost certain that she would have died. Firstly, whilst most of the crew and passengers were sucked out of the plane when it broke in half high up in the atmosphere, Vulović was not. As soon as the explosion happened, a food trolley slammed into her, pushing her all the way back into the fuselage, pinning her in place until she hit the ground. Second, Vulović suffered from hypotension her entire life. She had chronically low blood pressure. Now, this actually meant she should have never been an air hostess in the first place. Low blood pressure would have caused her to fail a J-80 Airlines medical exam, but she later admitted that she drank an excessive amount of coffee before the exam to artificially raise her blood pressure. Anyway, why did this medical quirk matter so much? Well, Vulović's unusually low blood pressure would have caused her to lose consciousness and black out almost immediately when the plane exploded. Crucially, this meant that she wouldn't have braced or tensed her body at any point during the descent and subsequent crash. Being unconscious and muscle relaxed would have protected her vital organs to some extent. And the low blood pressure would have also prevented Vulović's heart from exploding upon impact with the ground. The third factor in her survival was, of course, the landing itself. The fuselage, with Vulović still pinned inside, happened to fall upon a steep mountain slope that was blanketed in a dense woodland covered in snow. This provided layers of cushioning. As the fuselage hit the tree canopies full of powdered snow, it began to slide down the mountainside. But all the while, the violent forces of the crash were being gradually dissipated and softened by thousands of snow-covered branches. Lastly, yet another stroke of luck came into play to save Vulović's life. Despite being pinned in place by a food trolley, having low blood pressure, and the impact being cushioned by the winter wilderness, the crash was still incredibly violent, and the forces that had been exerted on this poor 22-year-old slender frame were extreme and should have been deadly. In fact, they probably would have been, if not for this last guardian angel. Because Vulović was still trapped in a fuselage in the middle of the freezing cold and remote Chechen countryside. She was passed out, her legs were broken in pretty much every way they could be, her pelvis and ribs were shattered, and she had a fractured skull, besides many other ailments. To say that she was in a bad way would be an understatement. Without critical care, fast, she would soon be dead. But her guardian angel came in the form of Bruno Honke, a local villager who just so happens to have been a field medic in World War II and had spotted the crash. So during his time, he'd attended his fair share of severely wounded soldiers on the battlefield. That meant he knew precisely what he needed to do upon entering the fuselage and discovering Vulovic's disfigured, semi-lifeless body. He promptly cleared her airway and stemmed sources of bleeding all over her body, keeping oxygen in her lungs and blood in her veins just long enough for hospital transport to arrive. As I've already mentioned, had any one of these 4 unique circumstances not had been true, Vesna Vulovic would not have survived the fall from 33,000 feet. Yet she did. Barely. Afterwards, she slipped into a coma for 27 days. During which time, there was a lot of speculation over what had happened. What actually caused this devastating incident? Well, terrorism was the obvious and immediate answer, particularly a group called Ustaše, who were Croatian nationalist extremists wishing to break Croatia away from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which was at the time a group of 6 countries controlled by communists. Throughout the 60s and 70s, this group were blamed for bombs and other attacks on trains, planes, and embassies. And, sure enough, it wasn't long before Yugoslav and Czechoslovak governments officially blamed Croatian separatists for planting the suitcase bomb on JAT Flight 367. Yet, to this day, we have no hard evidence that any such group was responsible for this particular massacre. And as we all know, it's sort of a universal law that an evidence vacuum must be filled with conspiracies. There are a few, and most of them claim that the suitcase bomb was a cover-up for something even more sinister. But the most popular of them is the shoot-down theory, which gained significant attention in 2009 when a German news station broadcast an investigative program centered around the idea that the JAT airline disaster of 1972 was not terrorism, but that the plane was actually shot down by mistake by the Czechoslovak Air Force. A theory that, if true, would mean that the Czech government had the blood of 27 innocent people on its hands. This theory, that was given life by 2 Prague-based journalists who spent a year investigating it, says that the DC-9 aircraft ran into technical problems and had to initiate an emergency descent, all the way down from 33,000 feet to 2,600 feet, which caused it to stray into a sensitive military airspace in Czechoslovakia. Suspecting it to be an enemy aircraft, it was tailed by an MiG fighter jet and was eventually shot down over Srpska Kaminska with friendly fire. The 2 Prague journalists' shoot-down theory is corroborated by eyewitness accounts from residents in Srpska Kaminska. Several locals claim they saw a low-flying passenger aircraft below the clouds, which was followed by the sound of jet engines. Some even claim to have seen a second aircraft in the sky, which adds serious fuel to the theory. But of course, this is all circumstantial, and eyewitness accounts are infamously unreliable. Although it's not strictly evidence, there is also the fact that the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Leonid Brezhnev, and East Germany leader Erich Honecker were flying home that day from a summit in Prague and would have been in this airspace around the same time. This would have meant that the Czechoslovak Air Force were probably on high alert and could have overreacted to a plane behaving strangely and flying at a low altitude. What's particularly interesting about this theory is that if it's true, it kind of explains how Vesna Vulovic survived what is widely considered to be an impossible to survive descent from 33,000 feet. Because it wouldn't have been that high at all. Her fall would have actually started at a much more modest 2,600 feet. Now don't get me wrong, the chances of surviving a fall from that high are still vanishingly small, but it's significantly more realistic than over 33,000 feet. The so-called shoot-down theory was even taken seriously by Guinness World Records, who officially recognised Vulovic's fall in the 80s. In 2009, they admitted that the findings of the Prague-based journalists were so compelling that they, quote-unquote, might have been duped by a swindle. But lacking any hard evidence, they never rescinded her record. Interesting side note, Guinness arranged for Paul McCartney, of Beatles fame, to personally award her certificate and medal in the 80s. Remember at the start of the video I mentioned she was a huge Beatles fan. As for herself, when Vulovic was presented with the shoot-down theory, she said it was nothing more than nebulous nonsense. And she might have a point. In 2009, in response to the shoot-down theory, an expert on the Czech army was interviewed for a magazine article and said that official Czech army policy at the time would not have been to immediately shoot down a suspicious aircraft, but to have intercepted it. Plus, any fighter jets in the area would have been detected on the radars of many of the major Western powers. And to top it off, the expert claimed that at least 150 people within the Czech military would have known about any operation to shoot down another aircraft, making an official cover-up next to impossible. Whether or not the fall was from 33,333 feet or 2,600 feet, it didn't matter for Vesna Vulovic. She had gone through a traumatic, life-changing event. She didn't care about the circumstances. She was still the sole survivor of one of the worst aviation disasters in history. Her medical recovery was long and arduous. She awoke from her month-long coma, not remembering a thing about the crash. When the doctor showed her a newspaper headline describing what had happened, she actually fainted. Vulovic spent another 9 months in hospital before being discharged. She slowly regained her ability to walk, but had a limp for the rest of her life, which all things considered seemed pretty minor. Even after receiving the luckiest get-out-of-death-free card in human history, and everything else she went through as part of her recovery, she still asked JAT if she could have her old job back and return to the skies as an air hostess. The airline refused because they thought she might attract negative publicity for some reason, but out of pity they did give her a desk job in Belgrade. And Vulovic quickly returned to taking flights as a passenger to overcome her fears. Unfortunately, Vulovic was fired from JAT in 1990 after attending anti-government protests. As a result, she suffered financially for the rest of her life in a small flat in Belgrade on a meagre pension, eventually succumbing to suspected heart failure and passing away in December 2016, aged 66. It's unknown whether the heart problems were related to her crash. But if you ask me, to walk away from an unaided fall from 33,000 feet and live another 44 years with relatively few complications is nothing short of a miracle. Now, I mean no disrespect when I say that after her crash, Vulovic lived a fairly unremarkable life. She turned down numerous media appearances, including Oprah and the BBC. The most recognition she received, aside from her Guinness World Record, was from a song dedicated to her by an obscure Serbian folk singer, Miroslav Ilic. But I think her guarded lifestyle was by design. Vesna Vulovic never sought fame. Through great tragedy and unfathomable odds, fame found her. She became a recluse in her later years, resorting to cutting her own hair to avoid trips outside, likely because of the attention. All Vulovic ever wanted to do was travel the world and get paid whilst doing it. And honestly, what I feel when I read her story is a twinge of sadness. That she only got to live that carefree lifestyle for a few short months in her youth. Whether she was happy about the fame her personal miracle brought her or not, one thing is for sure, she is truly an enigma in the tapestry of human tragedy. And she forged a record that, I have a sneaky feeling, will never be broken. Thanks for watching.